Greetings and welcome to SK Speaks. My name is Kwaw Johnson and I'm here with Adrienne Harding and Beth Degi. We are here to talk to you about child brides and gender violence. Before we start though, we have a short clip to show you.
Now, Admiral General, The Dictator is your first American movie, but you've starred in a lot of hits in your country.
Oh yes, that's right. I am box office uranium.
Okay.
You should see my previous films, such as You've Got Mail Bomb,
Okay.
Abducting Sarah Marshall, and The 14-Year-Old Virgin.
Oh, okay.
So Adrienne, from the video we are introduced to the issue of child brides. What does it mean to be called a child bride?
Well, according to the UN and according to most countries, a child bride is any girl who's married before the age of 18. This is not standard across the globe, but it's becoming a more recognized international standard that 18 is the legal age for marriage.
But child bride is not a new phenomenon. It's been happening for centuries. But why doesn't the media give it enough attention? They don't talk about it that much.
Yes, I don't really know why it doesn't get as much attention as it needs. In some developing countries, such as India, where there's a strong growing economy, it's very much talked about and researched and addressed by legal systems and different organizations trying to help families and girls find other opportunities through education, jobs and skills training. So that girls will be recognized for the other contributions they can give to their community besides being a wife or a mother.
I also think that there's a component of this lack of discourse in public, be it in the media here in the U.S. or I think that there's even a dearth of real scholarly engagement with this issue. And my hunch is that that is really related to the fact that this is more of a systemic problem. I was a journalism student in undergrad, and we had, if it bleeds, it leads. And with child brides, it's not this splashy headline that you're going to get like when we saw in the Bosnian War, where we had rape camps going on. That got a lot of play in the media, and I think it was a very splashy headline to put out there. And also these more concentrated direct violence where you have a victim that's very, very clearly been brutalized in some way. There's a more easy way to put a face on that violence than it is to put a face on child brides, because so much of this is quiet and so much of this is done in a way where it doesn't seem perhaps like overt violence. It's a young woman that's leaving one impoverished family to go into another impoverished family, and yes, there's forced sex involved in that, and there's childbearing before she's ready to, and often that comes with complications like obstetric fistula. But we're not seeing this as something that's like a big splashy crisis. We're seeing this as something that's more protracted, just like obstetric fistula as a result of lack of medical care. It's, again, something that we don't give a lot of attention to because we don't think of it as violence in this overt same sense that we do where it might be rape or brutal attacking through domestic violence, something like that.
Okay.
And I'd also just add that some countries just don't have the resources to tackle this problem, so it's not going to get the coverage, and some countries are more isolated. There's been a lot of back and forth in places like Yemen where it's been raised and dropped depending on political powers, that come to rise at each time. So there's a lot of factors influencing where it's researched and where it's not.
Now, Adrienne, I understand you did some research for an article you're writing on child brides. What were some of the things you focused on your research?
A lot of my research focus has been on the fact that there's not enough research on this issue. I've been fortunate enough to interview a child bride who was married when she was 15. She was from Jerusalem, and her parents took her aside one day and said that, "You're getting married." She dropped out of school the next day, and her new school started with her domestic training at home, how to cook, how to clean, how to sew. And she did break that cycle. She has 4 daughters, and they all went to college, and they all got to make their own choices for whom they married. The other aspect of my research has been on what programs can do to better address this issue, because many of them focus more on child brides as a side issue related to health. It's not really the forefront of their program. So by looking at the community, which, you know, places like India where the legal age to get married is 18, but these communities identify more with their rural communities than a faraway city that passed a law. To them, that's not really who they are. This is an important tradition. This is something that's celebrated. It's part of what makes their community their community. And so programs need to understand how this identity really influences how effective a program can be.
Where exactly does this phenomenon take place? I don't think it's evident in Europe or in North America, but more in Africa and Asia and maybe Latin America. Is there a reason for this?
It cuts across many cultures, religions. The most common factor you see is poverty and lack of education. Most of the research has found that education is the most important factor for ending this tradition. Generally, the more education a girl receives, the later she'll wait to get married, whether it's high school, college, graduate school. The longer she's in, the longer she will wait to get married.
You know, it's also interesting that you say there seems to be a lack of this in Europe and in North America. And I do agree that there's obviously a preponderance of evidence that's happening in more developing countries. But I was guilty pleasure watching TLC over the weekend, and they have a new show called My Big Fat American Gypsy Wedding. And they were profiling a family where they were hosting an extravagant Halloween party for the purpose of their 14-year-old daughter to meet a husband, you know, and was talking on and on about how she couldn't wait to meet her husband. And the mother of this 14-year-old could not have been more than 30, and it was really apparent that this was a generational thing that was happening and a cycle that was continuing. So I do think that there's probably pockets of this happening around the world, and it's much more closely tied to these more systemic factors rather than one cultural practice.
Not to change the subject, but in your research, did you find any evidence of it being on the male side rather than on the female side? Like males actually get married at a really young age or anything like that?
In some cultures, yes. In India, where it's outlawed, they'll have secret weddings at night, and I have seen a video where a camera had to be snuck in. And you see two very small children, maybe like 4 and 7. The boy is usually older. And they're married, and then they go home. It's a big ceremony, then they go home, and they just know that when the girl reaches puberty, she's going to go live with her husband. And he knows that that's going to happen at, you know, probably when she's 12 to 14.
Now, Beth, I know Adrienne mentioned a few reasons why we should actually examine or explore this child brides phenomenon. But is there any other thing you'd like to add to that?
You know, it's interesting. We've picked up on the poverty issue here, but I think one of the other factors that's at play here is the fact that women's chastity is so tightly conflated with family's value and social standing. And to me, your question about is this happening with men, boys being married off really young, and I think the reason it's so asymmetrical and disproportionate that it's girls being married off when they're young is that this isn't really about a girl going because her family thinks that she should be married off when she's young. It's often this push factor of there's poverty within the family of origin, and so the daughter is a burden. But there's also this other push factor where a girl's chastity and her perceived sexual purity is really tightly conflated with her family's social standing. So if a girl loses her virginity before she's married, or is whether that's through a sexual encounter that she chooses to partake in, or it's through a sexual violent encounter, such as rape or an assault, that diminishes her family's social standing because the woman's primary value within her household, in a lot of the system, in the family systems where we're seeing child brides as a common occurrence, the woman's primary value is to be of service to her husband and her husband's family, and also to be perceived as sexually pure in line with the gender ideology that's happening within that society. So like I said, one of the reasons you're seeing this asymmetry between girls being married young and boys being married young is that men's sexual purity doesn't really have anything to do with family status and value. You know, almost quite the opposite. I mean, even here in the U.S., we see a lot of times, you know, guys are players and girls are sluts, you know, and that kind of gets exaggerated to this very overt manifestation in the cultures in which child brides are really common, because you have this concept that a man's ability to be masculine, his identity as a masculine figure, is both as a father, his ability to raise children, especially young women who are sexually pure and in line with the gender ideologies of that culture, and also as a husband to maintain ownership of his wife's sexuality and keeping her in line. And Adrienne and I actually had the chance to travel to Cambodia last January, and we met with a group called Buddhists for Development, and we went out into the Kokam province, and we were meeting with women who were HIV positive and their children were positive, and we kept just meeting women and children, and I was asking why that was, and it was the men had already died, and the way that these women contracted HIV was the husbands would go out and pay about $2 US to sleep with a prostitute or a sex worker, and then they would come home HIV positive. The women have no social capital to demand that their husbands use condoms. They then contract HIV and end up caring for children that are HIV positive, because the children are then born HIV positive, as well as caring for themselves with HIV, you know, positive, and then shifting to AIDS. And the men often die much more quickly than the women because of lack of health care, and there does seem to be a lot of grassroots health care happening for women. But again, it's just this, once again, overt manifestation of the way women don't have any social standing within the home to demand their safety and security, both from a health standpoint, but also from this very basic standpoint of whether or not they're going to be married before they choose to be.
A lot of fathers feel pressure, too, for their daughters to marry them off quickly, because it ensures them, it protects them, it ensures their virginity, it ensures their status in the community. And also, if they wait too long to marry, these young girls are going to lose their friends because they've all been married, and the community might think, hey, what's wrong with this family? Why isn't this daughter married? And girls serve, you know, a role in the family. They can provide labor, usually domestic labor in the house, helping their mothers as a daughter, but as a wife, she can fulfill these duties as well as provide sex and children to her husband. So her value increases by becoming a wife.
Just a follow-up question, but are there many organizations working on this issue?
Yes, the UN's involved. There's different NGOs that have different strategies. There's a group called the Verni Project in Rajasthan in India, and they have a school, and they have found that to help these girls to break the cycle and get them in school, they actually have to pull them out of the community altogether to bring them to another city where the school is, because the family just feels so much pressure from the community. And even that's hard because they're being pulled out of school at such a young age, you know, 11 or 12. And either way, they're kind of pulled out of their home where they just want to be with their mom. So it's really, it's still tough, but it's working. There has been a lot of progress in that area where they're, you know, given an education, they can complete school, possibly go on to college if they want. They can, if they're an older, they'll also help brides who are already married and living with their husband. They can come and learn a skill so they can come back and contribute to their family, and if they choose to, they can return to their husbands, or they can try to get a divorce. They do legally have the right in India to get a divorce. So it just kind of provides a new option, a new door for these girls.
I want to piggyback on what you just said. You mentioned that even if the families are okay with breaking this pattern, and you know, our daughter's going to continue in school or not be married until she chooses her own husband, the social pressure from the surrounding community really impedes the family's ability to make a decision that's outside this norm of marrying their child off very young. And I think that that's really important to understand, is that this is acting as a structural system. This isn't just one family and another family and another family and another family independently making this decision that this is what's best for their daughter. You know, based on poverty, we need to have fewer children in the home, or based on our own personal belief that this is what's the right thing to do. It's also these surrounding cultural institutions, whether it be a gender ideology that conflates femininity with chastity, or masculinity with ownership and control of a woman's sexuality, or these actual, you know, extra-legal constructs where it's perfectly acceptable for a woman to be married off young because that's the traditional legal system, versus this legal system that's more removed perhaps in a capital city where these laws are being made, and there seems to be a very real disconnect between the rural regions, you know, and the capital cities. And so I think that we have to really, as practitioners or people interested in theorizing on this, we have to understand that this is not just people making decisions based on their own personal beliefs, based on something that is passed down from their families. There's also these surrounding social systems, be it the economic pressures, be it the extra-legal traditions, be it the religious beliefs in some systems. So I think that if we're going to address this from a practitioner standpoint and in our research, we really have to understand, you know, gender is an institution, and Pat Martin's work on that in Social Forces in 2004, she lays out a really strong argument that gender is a social institution. This is not just gender is what happens to women or what happens to men. It's how do gender ideologies reinforce and constrain the way people are able to behave within their social systems.
But Adrienne, one question I'd like to ask is, if this is part of their culture, something they've been doing for years and centuries, why should they stop it? Or what is the problem with this culture that needs to be stopped?
Well, it kind of prevents the community from growing economically and developing to get themselves out of poverty. It's going to hold them back because the cycle is going to continue. The mothers are going to pass this on to their daughters and their sons, and it just becomes a pattern that keeps repeating itself and repeating itself. And in places like India, where the economy is growing, they really recognize this. I think girls can go to school for free there. They can go to college absolutely free because they really want to break the cycle and give girls the incentive to participate actively in their communities, whether it's helping to build schools, whether it's getting involved in politics, whether it's just being more prepared to be a mother. You know, at that age, you're not even psychologically developed to be in a marriage, much less become a parent. So what are you able to teach your child? You know, how are they going to develop and become productive members of society? So I think there's a lot of research out there in places like Africa and India where we're empowering women and girls to become more productive members of society and a more open society with less stringent gender roles helps the whole society. The men will benefit from it as well.
Yeah, and I think that this cultural question is actually really probably the salient one for me is, you know, where do I, as this white woman from a middle-class home in Ohio, get off going to another culture and saying, well, this isn't right, you know, when they could easily come to mind and say many, many things about my experiences and my background. So I think that a couple of points, like this needs to be, if this is something that is problematic, that needs to be recognized from within. But I do think that that in and of itself is really challenging, because if you're saying, well, this is a cultural tradition that this ubiquitous society has decided to participate in, then it's okay. We're eschewing from the real argument, which is, who is they? Is this men that are continuing this tradition? Is this men and women that are continuing this tradition? And why are they continuing this tradition? And who has the autonomy and the authority to question whether or not it continues? You know, and a lot of the research around child bride shows that the mother-in-laws often gain social standing within their household when a child bride comes in, and so they have a very real vested interest in continuing this. And again, that goes to this whole idea of the woman's whole identity being conflated with her ability to serve the family and to, you know, her commodification of her sexuality. And so the older women within the family have a vested interest in continuing this cultural tradition, and the men have this vested interest because their social standing is really attached to their daughter's chastity or their wife's, the control of their wife's sexuality. And so if you have these kind of institutionalized rules, these gender ideologies that have really put you in lockstep with conforming to these cultural traditions, then there's not as much room to deviate from that. And so when we go in as Western practitioners or practitioners coming from a Western framework, whether or not we're from the US or from Europe, and we're saying, well, this tenet of your culture is wrong, I think that it's really, really dangerous, slippery slope to start down, because we're then pointing out things that we may not have a full awareness of the ways that it's operating. We may take into it, you know, our own assumptions that, well, this is because men are deciding that girls should be married off when they're young, or this is because mother-in-laws want to control younger daughters-in-law in their household. And I think that that, once again, overlooks the whole structural component of this, that this is really being propagated by outside forces within the community. And as practitioners, we have to be really, really conscientious as we go in, whether it's through an NGO, whether it's with the UN doing research, whether it's program evaluators working on, you know, looking at how these programs have changed the community. We have to be really, really cognizant of the fact that change always has to come from within, and it has to be done in a way that addresses the structural violence, not just the overt dynamics that are happening that are really, really obvious on the surface. We have to be addressing these larger educational systems, these larger economic systems. The poverty push factor is really, really key. And we have to be looking at the solutions as something systemic, not just addressing the phenomena of child brides from a, well, if we can just change the way that men think about their daughters or change the way that mothers-in-law gain power within the household, that's going to shift it. It has to be the education, the economic, the gender ideologies all working as a component where it can be holistically addressed.
So, Adrienne, what are some of the programs that are in place, and what are they hoping to address?
Right now, the programs in place, like I mentioned before, are really kind of focusing on child marriage as a secondary issue surrounding girls' reproductive health in the community. But one of the big things I said also they found that helps a lot is education. And then also you need to transform the idea of what it means to be a girl or a boy within the community, what it means to be a husband or a wife. And girls need to be seen as more than just wives and mothers. And they need to be recognized as individuals. So programs that can incorporate activities within the community to help people recognize the differences that are occurring, how people are experiencing their life in the community based upon their gender. So different activities where you have a game to play where people are separated into groups and one has one set of rules and one has another set of rules. So maybe the one that has less rules can go ahead farther and the one that has more restrictive rules can't do it. And then they can sit down and talk about this and try to understand how that translates to the gender roles in their society and within their community. And look for ways to recategorize and let girls speak and say, hey, I'm concerned about this in the community. I want my kids to go to school, you know, because she might be 16 and she might have 2 or 3 kids already. What does she want for her children? What are her wants and her needs? She's not just a mother. She's an individual in the community as well. So these kind of activities, which can be adapted for different cultures, different religions, I think can help to transform and help girls and women to be seen as individuals instead of just wives and mothers. I did see in my research a case of a girl who did not want to be married and I guess fought with her parents, and this NGO, this organization, was there to help her. And she went to school and she got a skill and she got a job in the community. And when she started bringing home a paycheck, her parents suddenly were like, oh, you know, you can help contribute to the family in other ways other than just domestic work, because their definition for what it was for her to live within the community and to contribute to the community didn't see this opportunity for her. And so this opening of business and jobs and education, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to go all the way to medical school. They can just get a skill that they can sell something to tourists. This can help them to end that cycle. And sometimes it's that quick. You know, the father just sees, oh, she's bringing home a check. This helps. You know, why don't we continue with this and see where this goes? You know.
Yeah. So finally, how can we end this cycle of child brides? From your point of view?
You know, I think that we've been touching on this a lot throughout the segment. I really do think that it has to be a holistic system. NGOs that are going in, and the UN, the World Bank, I think, and IMF also have a stake in this through their research apparatus. I think that there has to be a real recognition of the fact that this is a systematic practice. This is not something that is being, this is not just something that is being decided by individual families on behalf of their daughters. This is something that is in line with cultural gender ideologies that are being propagated both through individuals' participation in child marriages, but also through the continuation of these different cultural ideologies that really conflate women's identity and women's worth with their chastity, and men's identity and men's manhood with their ability to either have daughters that are perceived as sexually pure or conforming to sexual practices in line with whatever the culture dictates, and their ability to control their wives' sexuality. So I think that any solution that goes in and just targets the push factors of poverty are going to find that they're not able to transcend those more deeply entrenched gender ideologies. And I think Adrienne touched on a couple of different ways that those can be, I don't want to say challenged, but at least brought to the surface. These really deeply rooted social structures can be brought into more overt light, went through different practices like these games that you're talking about, and also through just work. I think CARE does really amazing work where they go in and work with the community as opposed to dictating what the right way to do something is, really fostering dialogues about how practices like child brides are challenging not just women's health or women's well-being and women's social standing, but also the community standing as a whole.
And I think it's also important to recognize whether you're a politician, an NGO, someone who wants to go in on the ground and do some help, an educator. It's important to have the law and the legal system on your side, but it's not enough. Mm-hmm. You need a way to recognize how these stringent, polarized gender roles are shaped by each culture, each community, each religious group, wherever they happen to live. And you need to be prepared to deal with it and address these issues on every level, on an individual level, in the community level, and in the structural level. So that might mean bringing more education to people that are part of the legal system, how to address this, how to enforce your laws without making people feel that you're enforcing something that's taking away their identity. How to talk to people about this. And you know, when I interviewed one child bride, I asked her what she thought could fix it, and she just said education, education, education. She said it 5 times. And for her, that was the most important thing to end this practice. And she was very adamant that her children all went to college and made their own choices.
Well, I'd like to thank both Beth and Adrienne for such an insightful talk about child bride, and hope to have you here again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.